Good afternoon. I'm Bob Martin, CIDP. I'll be moderating November's talk and introducing Dr. Massot. Dr. Massot is an associate professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. She's also a non-resident honorary fellow political economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis in New York, a senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation in Canada in Vancouver, and a non-resident fellow with the Center for China Studies, National Taiwan University, Taipei. Dr. Massot is the author of China's Vulnerability Paradox, the world's largest consumer transformed global commodity markets, which has won the 2025 Best Book Award in International Political Economy from the International Studies Association, and will be your topic today. In 2022, she was a member of the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs Indo-Pacific Advisory Committee. She also served as a senior advisor for China and Asia in the offices of various Canadian cabinet ministers, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, at different points between 2015 and 2021. Her research interests include the global political economy of China's rise, China's impact on global extractive commodity markets, including debates around de-risking, critical minerals, and economic security, Canada-China relations, China narratives, and the advent of Indo-Pacific strategies around the world. She was a Taiwan Fellow and visiting professor at the Graduate Institute of East Asian Studies, National Chengchi University. In the winter of 2025, she received her PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Without further ado.
Thank you so much, Bob, for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. And even though he's not in the room, thank you to Michael Murphy for originally sending me an invitation and to come over here to speak. And I'm going to try to do a couple of things today. It's a book talk, so I am going to speak, walk you through my book's, argument, but I also, building on my book's work, have been developing a research project on critical minerals. And so I would also like to spend a little bit of time at the end of my talk to walk you through what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to try to do those two things. We'll see how far I go along those lines. So the first part of the talk is going to be structured pretty, in a standard way, standard book talk, walking you through what got me interested in the topic of my book and how I proceed then to just build a theoretical framework to explain the surprising puzzles that I'm trying to answer, and then going through some of the argument, empirical narratives, et cetera. And as I say, number 7, I hope we get, I have enough time to tell you a bit about what I'm doing right now. At any point, so I may go over, some slides a little fast. If you want to come back to any of them later on, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. So, at face value, the topic of the book is a little dry. So unless you're interested in minerals, I mean, of course, today critical minerals is le topic du jour. So maybe you're hearing a bit more about minerals. But back in 2010, when I embarked on this research, it wasn't so. They were just minerals. Let's put it this way. They weren't critical. Just to sort of give you a taste of how the minerals that I chose to study in this book are coming back in the news. So in the book, I study iron ore, I study copper, I study uranium, and I study fertilizer or potash. Just this past fall, there have been some news items. If you read the Financial Times, you might have picked up on those. There's a Chinese entity, the China Minerals Resources Group, that has been negotiating with BHP Billiton, one of the top iron ore exporting firms, in a very tough way. And it's been making the news, and I'm going to come back to it later on in the talk. And sort of now what I'm going to do is go back 15 years, and hopefully by the end of the talk, you can understand a little better the fight that's happening here today. Back in 2010, what got me interested in the iron ore market, and this is really the core empirical case of my book, is this headline. And I see there are many students in the room and maybe some online. Sometimes the most unique or sort of idiosyncratic piece of empirical detail can just draw you in. This was it for me. And this headline, the article is written by Javier Blas, who's still a journalist. I think he's at Bloomberg now, writing on energy markets. And he's writing, annual iron ore contract system collapses. So at the time, in 2010, just to replace you a little bit in the debates of the time. So I was already studying the political economy of China. I was starting my PhD, and I didn't have sort of an empirical project to sink my teeth in, but I was very immersed in the China debates. And in 2010, the China debates in international political economy and IR more generally were basically structured along the following lines. Either China was going to integrate global economic institutions, right? That was the Eikenberry argument, 2008 Foreign Affairs, for example, or it was going to disrupt them, basically. I mean, now the argument has evolved quite a bit. There's fewer people on the first side of the argument, as you will. But at the time, that was the way the debate was structured. And what I was looking for is, and I'm a political economist, so I was looking in the sort of economic sphere, evidence for institutional impact. We were sort of wondering, is China integrating? Is China disrupting? And I was like, okay, show me something. Like, show me an institution that's been impacted by China so that I can study this empirically. And so that headline grabbed me because I was like, at the time we were also speaking a lot about degrees of, China's GDP or export data. And it was always sort of on a sliding scale, but I wanted evidence of institutional change. And so that's what caught my attention here. There was something that existed that China, or I didn't know at the time, but where China had a sort of major part in, because it was the major iron ore importer, some institutions ceased to exist. Okay, so that's the sort of departure point. As I started to, because I had no idea what the benchmark pricing system was that Javier Blas was saying was collapsing, right? So I started to read a little more and understanding the puzzle. Like, this event got more and more interesting. So interesting, in fact, that I spent like years trying to understand how and why it happened the way it happened. What's a benchmark pricing system? Well, for decades before the moment that Javier describes, the price was set between major iron ore exporters, so the firms that still export iron ore today, BHP, Vale, Rio, and the Japanese importers, because before China's emergence, Japan was the major iron ore importer. And so they used to get together every year behind closed doors, discuss, come to an agreement as to the price, and then the price became the benchmark for the year. And so it was a negotiated pricing system. That collapses in 2010, and what rises in its stead is spot pricing. So higher volatility, higher velocity, shorter timeframes, with a lot of spot trading platforms that emerge as well. And so the decade that follows looks like this, right? So you have this sort of Japan era, a very stable benchmark pricing. China emerges as #1 consumer in 2003. By 2010, the system falls apart, and that's what comes, right? And so you have the transition from a sort of very stable negotiated pricing regime to a very volatile, financialized pricing regime. Why is this interesting for somebody like me who's trying to understand China's impact on global economic institutions? So I mentioned the first part. It's a turning point, an institutional change. Lovely, right, for a comparativist. But there's something else that drew me in. Because remember, China's a state-led hybrid economy, right? And no matter how we characterize liberal side of the debate in the 2010s, nobody was arguing that China was going to go around liberalizing global markets, right? It didn't go that far. So, and the more I looked at that, no matter how you tried to characterize that change, it resulted in increased financialization and increased volatility and liberalization of that pricing system. And that theoretically, for me, was extremely puzzling. How can I explain this? And I didn't really have enough empirical knowledge and also even the conceptual tools to explain this, because at the time, and still I would argue today, it's still a problem, we conceptualized global markets prior to China's rise as liberal. So it was impossible conceptually to even think of liberalization of certain markets as a result of China's rise, just the way that our sort of mental maps were built. It didn't work. So that's also what sort of kept me going with this event. I said I'm a comparativist, so the next step I needed is to find good comparative cases to create friction or sort of leverage. And so what I set out to do originally is to find a very good method of difference comparison. So in other words, a case that would share a lot of similarities with the iron ore case, so that would be structured similarly internationally, that would be broadly comparable on a whole host of variables, and where China would also be the dominant consumer, so that I'm comparing similar sort of structurally similar cases, and that also had a benchmark pricing system. But I didn't know at the time, because I also didn't know the potash market at all, what would happen to that pricing system. When I picked those two cases in 2010, I didn't know how this benchmark pricing system would evolve in the potash situation, years from then. But so there you go. So I had these two cases that were structured similarly. China emerges as key consumer. In one case, we have the fall of the benchmark, and until today, in the potash case, I mean, I can nuance this a little bit towards the very end of the early 2010s and 2020s. But the benchmark system survives. So basically, you have institutional change in one case and institutional continuity in the other, is the main puzzle in empirical comparative puzzle of the book. So the way I structured the book is along those three puzzles. I've already mentioned this one, the liberalization puzzle. I can give you my thoughts on that one at the very end. And then the first puzzle I call the variation puzzle. This ends up being very theoretically rich. I end up selecting two further cases, as I mentioned originally. So essentially, there is variation in how China impacts global markets. It's not uniform across the board. So it's a variation puzzle. Why variation? Second puzzle, and this I came to really fully appreciate it as I was doing my interviews. I did over 160 interviews in China and internationally for this book. Is what I call a vulnerability puzzle, and that ended up making it on the title of the book, China's Vulnerability Paradox. Is as I was speaking to market stakeholders in China, whereas from the outside, we have the impression that China is very powerful, very dominant, and it's true today in critical minerals as well. On the ground, the market participants were not telling me we feel in control and really dominant. We've got this, we can shape global markets. That's not at all what I was hearing, right? I was hearing them telling me that they felt they were price takers and that they weren't able to match the big mining firms, and the power of the global iron ore exporting firms especially bothered the Chinese importers a lot. They felt vulnerable, actually, and they kept telling me this over and over again, and it sort of sunk in. And that's the other puzzle that I tried to sort of work through in the book. How can the biggest market actor feel vulnerable? That's weird. So hopefully I can provide you some of those insights as we go through. Before I go there, though, there's a couple of things that I need to make clear as to how I proceed, because I don't define markets, perhaps as some of you have been used to seeing them defined. I do want to sort of drive the point home of the importance of variation, not only as a comparativist, but as we look at international institutions. So I straddle the fields of comparative and international political economy. So variation is important at the international level as well, not only domestically. And then the importance of market power in how I think about China's relationship with global stakeholders. Okay, so I see markets not as the atomistic sort of liberal definition, but as institutional ecosystem. A quick way to convey to you how I think about markets is in those four, this at the bottom, those four qualifiers. So for me, markets are created as opposed to spontaneous. They're embedded as opposed to autonomous. This is Polanyi, for those of you who read him. I see markets as disputed as opposed to self-adjusting. That's more Carr and Kirshner and Gilpin. And I see markets as plural as opposed to homogeneous, especially and including at the global level. So this is me drawing from comparative political economy literature that sees domestic systems of political economy as varying for good reason, and applying this at the global level. Global markets vary too. So that's for markets. Variation, I think I've just mentioned it. I think it's something that the comparative political economy literature takes seriously, but for some reason, sometimes we lose track of how this is important in China when we look at China from the outside. We sort of assume sometimes that because the party is so powerful, that things are homogenous in China. But just like everywhere else, China is home to profound levels of variation across different systems of political economy, different industries. And so I've just pulled up here some of the numbers from the China Mining Era book. I used 2008 because I'm looking at 2010, right? That's an institutional moment of change. And so this just gives you one angle. This is the proportion of medium and large enterprises in different Chinese mining sectors. So it just gives you one angle of variation. So you can see here the market I'm looking at, the potash market, is much more concentrated than some of the other markets. This has changed, by the way. Rare earths has gone through cycles of consolidation that have been quite successful. But iron ore and coal, less so, still fragmented to this day. So in other words, it's just show you don't need to necessarily think too deeply about any of this, but just to show you that market structures vary inside of China. And the same thing is true internationally. So global commodity markets don't necessarily shake out the same way around the world. Some of them are much more geographically concentrated than others. Some of them are home to more concentration of market share than others. And so I just put together the geographic and firm concentration numbers, but you see that it goes from, below 30% to above 80%. For potash here, in terms of geography, you have quite a bit of variation as well. So just to say, we have variation at both levels. As I drill down into the iron ore market, I learned that it was fragmented. I mentioned lots of firms. But it was importantly fragmented at the import interface. So it wasn't only fragmented in general. The number of firms that imported iron ore was also very high. So at this little touch point between domestic and international market stakeholders, you had fragmentation. So much so actually that in the 2000s, the two top firms importing iron ore for China made up, by the end of the middle of the 2010s, made up less than 10% of volume of iron ore imports. That's very, very low. The top three Japanese firms import closer to 70% of iron ore for Japan. So that's a very fragmented market. When I look at the numbers, I'm going to show you so this is the same numbers for R&R, just presented differently with more data points. Two top firms, two top importers. So I have import data by firm up to 2015 for everything, actually, but the commodities in China. And so this is what R&R looks like. Copper looks relatively similar in the sense that the interface is more fragmented. You see the other end of the scale, right? Uranium. There are just two firms who import uranium in China. And then you see potash, which has some variation. There's a little bit of increased competition at the import interface, but we're still really, really high, right? When I study this, we're at around 60% of import share for the two top Chinese potash importers. And this ends up being something that's really important in explaining how China interacts with global commodity markets, in my view. I made a comment about market power. I don't know if I want to spend too much time here, but I build an argument around this notion of market power, and I just wanted to mention that I define it in my book as coordination capacity. I can speak more to that in the Q&A if you want, but basically I'm interested in the ability of actors to solve their collective action problems, to coordinate effectively in the face of this international market. And notice this word here. So I'm interested in the differential ability of Chinese stakeholders to coordinate their things. So in other words, are they facing a coordinated market internationally or a fragmented one? And what is their state of coordination? So this is what I'm interested in, not them in isolation, but how it compares to international stakeholders. The vulnerability paradox, you can ask me about some more in the Q&A. The argument that I develop is the following, that relative positions of market power between Chinese and international stakeholders explain both key variation in China's behavior and the likelihood of institutional change. Remember, I'm asking a question about variation of institutional change internationally. Again, I don't know how much of a fan you are of 2x2 tables. I am a big fan of 2x2 tables. Not everyone is. Basically, my four cases display different levels of fragmentation and coordination, either the domestic or international level. So you have cases where, both sides are fragmented, internationally and domestically, like copper. You have cases where both sides are pretty coordinated, like potash. So that means that internationally, the exporters are coordinated. Chinese importers are coordinated. So this leads to different kinds, you can imagine, right? Different kinds of interactive patterns when you have this. And then I have my R&R case here, right? Remember, very fragmented domestically in China, quite coordinated internationally. And so the Chinese there are in this position of market power vulnerability that I described. But as I looked into the history, right, of the R&R pricing regime, remember I mentioned that Japan was the lead importer before China. So I asked myself, well, how did this relationship look like in the 80s and 90s when Japan was at the helm? So I have a section of my book where I go into that. And I figured out that Japan, contrarily to China, had been extremely coordinated in its approach. And at the time, the market was much less concentrated. And so Japan was actually in a position of market power during its tenure. And what happens between the sort of 90s and the 2000 and 2010s is this shift, this power transition, we could call, between an asymmetric position of market power in favor of the consumers to the opposite scenario, where the market power is in favor of the producers in the 2010s. So you have this happening. And what I argue in my book is that those are, when you have large disruptions in market power relationships, you have the most likelihood of institutional change. This is basically the argument that I generate in my book, is that when you have continuity in market power relations, maybe you have more continuity in international economic institutions, but when you have huge disruption, of course, it's going to be more disruptive, and you're likely to see a little bit more, at least window of opportunity for sort of institutional disruption. And this is what I see in my case. To give you briefly a little bit more empirical color as to what the years before the fall of the benchmark pricing regime look like. I mentioned that China takes over Japan as #1 importer in 2003. At the time, Japan is still negotiating the benchmark price. So China, grows a little frustrated. 2003 goes by, 2004, 2005. By 2006, the lead Chinese importer, Bao Steel, at the time, negotiates the contract before the Japanese. And that contract becomes the benchmark. So the Chinese really take over the Japanese and being the lead benchmark price setters. So I imagine they're happy about that a little bit, but place yourself back in 2006. Half of you were perhaps not old enough to read the Financial Times, but for those of you who were, we are in the middle of a commodities super cycle building up. Prices are going up very fast in the lead up to the global financial crisis. And so the Chinese are taking over at a time where they have to agree to very high price hikes. And so we know now with hindsight that there was perhaps little that Bao Steel could do individually as a company at the time, but then it didn't look that great, right? Because every year in 2006 and 2007, they were negotiating very high price rises. So the industry association in China grows unhappy. They have industrial associations in various sectors. So CISA, the China Iron Ore and Steel Association, takes over the negotiations in 2009 and says, okay, we're going to deal with this. And this is the year after the global financial crisis. Stocks are falling, and they come in and say, we're going to really negotiate some huge price cuts here. And they ask, while the negotiations are ongoing, that Chinese firms refrain from buying iron ore on the global markets, of course. That's where the problem is. So there are too many Chinese firms. CISA's hold on the market is not strong enough. The lead SOEs are too small of a share of import volume. And to make a long story short, medium and smaller iron ore importers ignore CISA and just go around and buy iron ore anyways on what ends up being an emerging spot price because there is no benchmark. And so it is really the failure of China's industry association to coordinate the behavior of its own firms that lead to a breakdown of that system. Now, of course, the producers are only too happy to jump on that opportunity. And the spot pricing regime brings huge, many, many years up to today of profitability for the iron ore exporters, right? Bringing you back to the news item I showed you earlier. If the Chinese government had read my book, they may have, in the lead up, this is something that they might have done. So in 2022, the Chinese government announced the creation of a large iron ore import coordination enterprise called the China Mineral Resources Group, whose task would be to coordinate iron ore buyers and explicitly to increase China's bargaining power compared to the large iron ore exporters. It is explicitly a coordination attempt. It's a $3 billion state-owned behemoth that led to the news that I showed you earlier, which is that it has taken a very tough negotiating approach towards BHP earlier this fall. And if you read here, China's state-run iron ore buyer has told major steelmakers and traders to temporarily halt purchases of all new BHP Group cargoes, escalating a pricing dispute. It is a replay of what happened in the lead-up of 2010. And just yesterday, I was reading on the news that we are hearing of cargo deliveries from BHP to Chinese buyers. And so this is still a fight that is difficult for China to win, the coordination fight with its own domestic sort of very messy and fragmented and dynamic domestic enterprises. Okay, just to give you the quick empirical comparison with potash, I've given you one picture. How can it look like in a case where buyers are more coordinated, more effectively so? So in the fertilizer industry, specifically the potash industry, potash is one of 3 crop nutrients that we need to apply. China does mine some potash, but not sufficiently. And so became one of the world's top potash consumer actually in 2002, one of the key importers to this day. What happened there though in 2005? So first of all, the import interface is much more coordinated. There's 2 very large Chinese state-owned enterprise that import, you've seen, remember the 4 graphs, right? The potash graph had a higher level of import interface coordination. Sino Agri and Sino Chem, Zhonghua and Zhongnong, have agreed to form, along with a few other smaller potash firms, coordinating small group. It's an institutional setup in the Chinese system where elements get together to coordinate across various either jurisdictions or institutional lines. So it's basically a coordination outfit. And every year, they get together and negotiate a strategy before going out and facing exporters of potash. They mainly have been splitting the global market in 2. Sinochem mainly deals with the Canadians, and Sino Agri mainly deals with the Russians and the Belarusians. And whomever settles the price first, the other takes that price as benchmark and sort of prices in all sorts of other modifications depending on transports and all that. But basically they coordinate their act, right? And this price is the global benchmark as well that other firms around the world take as a sort of reference point for negotiating their own contracts. And so this is a more coordinated picture at the other end of the spectrum, right? And the institutional manifestations of price setting survive to this day. Okay, so, not all of you are interested in iron ore or potash. I accept that. So why should you care regardless? So here are 5 broader implications of what I'm doing, or rather the sort of research that I've completed on this front. So the first one, I've labeled China as a heterogeneous power as opposed to China as a unitary power. So I think it's very important that we take time in assessing China's behavior and impact internationally empirically before making assumptions across the board. China behaves differently in different issue areas. A few scholars that have started to make that pretty clear in the literature. So China behaves differently in the global climate change sphere than it does on Taiwan, or that it does in the South China Sea, or that it does in tech. So we see, and why that is, part of the explanation is because of the different domestic roots of that behavior. So I'm encouraging us to go look inside of China to understand the dynamics that do explain the momentum of China's behavior abroad, and encouraging us to accept that there is variation across the board. In my case, even within an issue area. So it's not like climate change, China's like this, and defense, China's like that. No. In commodities across markets, I have seen different types of behavior. So we have to take this seriously. Second, the importance of unintended consequences. So something that we do a lot when we reflect on China's impact on global markets or global institutions, is to look at the outcome and presume that this was the intent, right? China does X, or as a result of China's behavior, X happens. Well, Xi Jinping must have wanted this, right? And what I find in the iron ore case, if you place yourself back in it, the fall of the benchmark was not the intended consequence of China's behavior. And I actually went, or what's the expression? I expended a lot of energy in trying to ascertain that really the China Iron Ore and Steel Association and the leading SOEs did not want this to happen. I have multiple interviews with people who have assured me from inside of CISA and the government that no, this was not the intent. This was something that we did not want to see happen, right? And so only by process tracing the series of events that led to the outcome am I able to know that. And if I would have assumed intent from the outcome, I would have assumed that the Chinese system wanted to kill the benchmark, right? And this is not true. And this would have been pretty bad. And if I found this in one case, I can assure you it's not the exception, right? There's a lot of other cases where China's interaction or impact on global affairs does not reflect the original intent for a variety of reasons, but we need to study and process trace to know that. What about this liberalization puzzle? Only by problematizing what we mean by liberal can we see the evolution of market institutions properly, I would argue. If we assume that markets were open and liberal, free from power relations, sort of working very well before China rose, and China rose to disrupt all of that, only by assuming this can we make the argument that China's disrupting liberal market institutions, etc. If we nuance a little bit or complexify our way to look at markets and market power, the story becomes a little bit more messy. The iron ore market was not liberal when China rose as number one consumer, right? It was one of the most concentrated markets. The three top firms exported upwards of 70% of global iron ore exports. The pricing regime was a negotiated pricing regime that happened behind closed doors. I mean, this is not the definition of a competitive open market, right? And China didn't feel that way. So we have to actually ask ourselves, what do we mean by liberal? And we have to look at power relations in markets. And even historically speaking, to properly look at the future of whatever it is that we want to pursue, reglobalization, call it what you want, we need to be honest about what came before. And to understand why China feels the way it does with regards to certain market institutions, we have to look at them with a serious attention to power relations in markets even before China rose. So this is the basis of an ongoing research project about the sort of third pillar of international liberal order. And I spoke about vulnerability a little bit. I'm happy to speak more about it, and I'll just finish with this one. I think it's very important as China becomes a systemically relevant power, so structural, the power to structure global markets as opposed to a sort of institution taker. It's very important that we look at resonance dynamics between Chinese domestic and international market institutions. It's the same thing for the American market, right? But now we need to do this with China too. And China will need to also learn to accept this. So there are international impacts now of Chinese domestic policy making decisions that range all the way to Brazil and Thailand and Canada and Spain and everywhere, right? And so this is a turning point, I feel, where China has gone from a large power to a systemically relevant power. And this means all sorts of new, very important questions that we need to be asking and answering. I have completely failed to finish this part of my talk in 30 minutes so that I could speak to my current research on critical minerals in the other 10, the sort of latter part of my talk. So I feel like I have to stop here to allow you to ask questions. And if you do have questions about my research on critical minerals, or you'll have to invite me again to give a different talk on critical minerals, I'll have to stop here. And thank you very much for your attention.
Unless you get questions on that. So if you wish to ask her about me, or she didn't get it. Okay, any questions from the audience?
I'll start us off. I have so many questions. I'm gonna focus on one. There's been so much talk, about. Yes. There's been so much talk, a few years ago about this whole tendency towards wolf warrior diplomacy. It's died down a bit, this focus now, and there were, problems with that media obsession around that. And part of it was the overstating or over assumption that it was actually an effective strategy, right? And that it wouldn't have any implications on the ability of Chinese actors to actually realize their objectives. I see some parallel with what you were describing about the tough approach. So I'm wondering if the parallel holds, to what extent, and if that approach has backfired or not, or like what does it actually look like also, like in terms of actual practices of having that tough approach, and what's the result, what's the outcome from the perspective of like Chinese interests, but also like the overall impact on the system. I hope that question's clear.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I have never, it's always a treat when you get a question you've never quite heard before. So that's great. I think that the kinds of dynamics internal, so there are a few things that may look the same between the case I described here and the case of the sort of failed wolf warrior diplomacy approach. And there are a few ways in which they are not alike. And I think even unpacking this would be so rich. And those are not the two only cases. There are other cases where the Chinese government or sort of ecosystem produces patterns of behavior that are not seemingly, from the outside and frankly from the inside too, really productive. I think that China's not the only one, right? We could identify so many American dynamics that are the result of structural or institutional characteristics of domestic political systems that produce patterns of behavior that seem to go against American interests, right? So I think it's the same kind of thing, right? But what's the interesting, so for a China scholar, it would be interesting to unpack what are the specific types of structural design or polity system, based dynamics that lead to those kinds of patterns. And in the case of wolf warrior diplomacy, it seems to me that this is something, and others have written about this, that's specific to the Xi era, and a sort of return to very centralized and quite assertive and tough rule from the center that has led to dynamics by people in the system trying to sort of the one-upmanship, trying to please up And that has led to all sorts of dynamics that we also actually see during the COVID zero era. Sort of policymakers try to undo one another, updo one another, in trying to respond to signals coming from the top. This is something that's specific to the Xi era. But the roots of the fragmentation that I observe in the iron ore case run deep, and they have to do with the industrial history of various industries in China. And so you would have to go back in the history of sort of steelmaking and steelmaking in China, sort of to really unpack why this industry has remained so fragmented and so localized in power at the provincial level. And so there's something else going on there too. But yeah, great question. Like, this is exactly the kind of question that would be so productive for comparativists to unpack. Yeah, thank you.
Another? If I may self-promote, speaking of Cold War diplomacy, the January talk will be on securing the Canadian Arctic by looking at Arctic intelligence and how some of the organizations are still stuck in Cold War mentality. I promise I'll be brilliant.
This is a great talk, fascinating approach to IPE. And I think I have to buy the book and think more carefully about your 2x2 and make sure I understand how that works. I have 4 related questions.
Ooh, I need a pen. Yes.
The first is that involution is the word of the month, the
Yes.
word of the fall. And I understand that to mean that the state wants to reduce Chinese firms competing with each other because the effect is deflationary.
Right.
So I'm wondering if that's coming for the iron ore industry.
Yeah.
Which leads to the bigger question that you got at a little bit, which is the role of the state and the role of state-owned enterprises, which in my world, which is trade, is what everybody obsesses about when we think about China.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to asking about what are they doing with all this iron ore? And presumably they're exporting a lot of it, which for close to 10 years now has had the US, EU, Japan, to a limited extent, Canada, fretting about excess capacity in the steel industry. And China's unhappiness with how that played out led to the OECD process collapsing. We don't really know what was going on in there because the numbers provided were not transparent in any way, shape, or form. And finally, coming back full circle on you, I read in the FT yesterday, the day before, that there is a gigantic mine coming on stream in Guinea.
Yes.
That will really make a mess, I would think. There we go. That could really make a mess of the global steel industry, but also presumably give overwhelming market power to China, and too bad for Western Australia.
Exactly.
So that's a lot that one.
It is.
There you are.
Yeah. No, that's great. We should have coffee and unpack this over an hour. So, I mean, I can start with this one. It's so tempting. Just bear with me. I said I would skip over the vulnerability part, because I speak about the vulnerability puzzle from the top. There are many ways in which being a latecomer can offer some advantage in terms of development, right? Going back to Gerschenkron and so on. China as a latecomer, quote unquote, to some of the minerals consumption meant that the best deposits were already taken. And it has led it to explore further reaches around the world of deposits that may have been located in places where there was less stability, either politically or otherwise. And this was one example. So this I'm referring to sort of this. And this led China to Guinea. And it has invested from the very beginning in the Simandu project. And for decades, for 2 decades, right, it was going almost nowhere. And a lot of experts are, even wondering whether it's true that the first shipment is going to occur. It seems to be true that the first shipments, are coming out of this mine. China has been working, knowing what I've described, its position of market vulnerability, its feeling that it was very vulnerable compared to the very powerful global mining industry, to rebalance that ledger through international investments. And this project, if it does come through, will allow China some more bargaining power and leverage. And I think it's no coincidence that the China Mineral Resources Group that has been created in 2022 only just now has taken a very tough approach in negotiating with BHP, because the ore is going to come out of Simandou in November, December. So I think that there is a relationship between this mine coming online and China's attempt and feeling that it can maybe exert a little bit more bargaining power with some of the Australian and maybe Brazilian iron ore firms. And so I think it's all related, right? So it's a great comment. I think that the intensity of the efforts with which China has built positions of dominance in the refining and processing segments of the mineral, critical mineral supply chains also derive from this sentiment of market power vulnerability. China remains very import dependent, and 50% of the critical minerals you may be thinking of right now. But it has built positions of dominance in the refining and processing segment, very consciously so over the past decades. I would argue because it has felt resource vulnerable from the very beginnings of the PRC. You could go back to 1950, right? And China's always felt like this. Your three other questions are very good. So yeah, in some ways, the involution issue has some resonance with what is happening in the iron ore and steel industry. And Lizzie Lee is very good on this. There's multiple places you could read her. She's at Asia Society, and her explanation, which I think is very good, is that the Chinese system has been built around provincial centers of political economy, which have led to very intense pursuit of similar goals across different locales, with a very, very high level of intensity and state involvement that has led to competition, very hyper competition in multiple areas, and overcapacity is the term we should define, but let's use it for the moment. Overcapacity. And so this problem of sort of intense competition and large volumes of production of certain types of things across China is systemic. It's something that's a product of the system. I don't think that it's intended from the start. Again, going back to my point about intention, I think it's more of a symptom of systemic design around all sorts of things like tax and state incentives, rather than something that's intended. So the Chinese government doesn't, like the notion of overcapacity very much, but it has publicly now stated that involution is a problem and is trying to address this issue. We have heard in the context of iron ore and steel, the Chinese government saying that it would address such problems multiple times over the past 30 years, really. And it hasn't had a lot of success because the causes are so deeply structurally embedded. So we are now in a different, world with a government that's more centralized, but, than in the Hu Jintao era. But I still remain, it remains to be seen how effectively the government is going to be able to handle, maybe, yes, the delivery drivers, but the steel industry, it's a very big chunk of the Chinese economy. So you raise also another question, which is, I mean, you didn't specifically speak about the real estate industry, But a lot of the steel, right, a lot of what the steel was going into was the real estate sector, and that's not doing very well in China. And I think that in some ways, the difficulties of the Chinese system domestically are being, so from 10 years back, right? I think the Xi Jinping government has decided to solve some of the domestic fractures of the Chinese system by going even more intensely international. So the sort of wave of exports that we see is also a result of some of the failings domestically to address some of the problems of the Chinese economy. Now, one of the issues that China is getting into and is going to have to think about much more seriously than it has to date, even with the news of the last 5-year plan that is coming out, is addressing the pushback that it is getting now from the global south in terms of industrial capacity. So yes, you know, China may be able to push back against an American argument, but is it able to push back against a Thai and a Turkish and an Indian and a Brazilian and a, you know, a Southeast Asian argument that no, it's not going to work. We're not going to be able to accept your products. You're killing our domestic industrial, you know, we can't go up the industrial value chain. China's taking too much space in terms of consumer good production. This is something that China is going to have to address. You know, the West saying something is one thing, but the global South saying it is something else. So this is unresolved, and I think it's really like a big, the big global economic issue that China's leaders are going to have to deal with in the coming little while that they haven't yet been able to get a handle on. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one last question. I'll take it from online, one of our online viewers, and not just because it's from the director of CIDP.
Great.
Thank you for this thought-provoking talk. I find the conceptual discussions of market and market power particularly profound. Given this concept of market power, what are the implications for Canada's current economic re-engagement with China?
That's a great question. So thank you for the question. And I could go a couple different ways on this one, but I feel like really as political economists, the past 15 years have been a journey. And we find ourselves, maybe especially for political economists of East Asia who have been used to speaking about the role of states in the economy and used to interact with, you know, policymakers and academics and government officials in East Asia who take for granted that the role of the state in the economy is something that you need to figure out how to do, not whether to do. This wave of the return of economic nationalism and industrial policy is just washing over us right now. And I don't think that in Canada we have a lot of the muscle memory and conceptual wherewithal to immediately engage in a productive way in the constructive industrial policy and speak about the role of the state in the economy in a way that immediately will make a ton of sense to the Canadian public and to other even bureaucrats. And so that I find that extremely interesting, in that the sort of mirroring dynamics now of American, Canadian, and other policymakers making decisions that, you know, they were accusing East Asian governments of making over the past decades. So that's on the sort of return of the role of the state in the economy and the steering, the notion that now the Canadian government needs to steer the economy more actively, and that as Canadian publics, we have to have opinions as to how we want our government to steer our economy, and the notion that we should get out of the way of the market to let the market sort of find the best solution is not an option anymore. I find that fascinating. And this is relevant when it comes to China, because there's a whole range of issues that present themselves very differently if we see the role of government as steering the future of the Canadian economy in directions that we choose by investing in particular sectors with industrial ecosystems, goals, et cetera, in mind, as opposed to sort of creating the regulatory conditions for market forces to operate. And in the context of China, I think that there are you know, in Canada, we have the problem that we're also very close to the, you know, we're stuck on the North American continent, as it were. We can't like, sort of sail off. And our relationship with the American economy right now is so fraught and complicated. So we can't 100% take decisions. You know, we can't at all take decisions independent of that. But I feel like some questions about Canada-China relationships, that the relationship that have industrial angles to them, like critical minerals, can be approached differently from an industrial policy perspective than we perhaps were ready to approach them like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when this was not on the table. I'm speaking a little bit like in oblique ways, but I think the notion of China being at the frontier of some technological spaces right now where we need to engage on critical minerals is something that we haven't fully deeply appreciated, but that is the reality. And so we're going to have to think about how we interact with a sort of active government industrial policy outlook, firmly, you know, driving the Canadian economic vehicle rather than waiting for stuff to happen. And I think there are some things that we could accomplish there if we are strategic and careful about it.
Okay, with apologies to questions that did not get asked because of time, would you please join me in thanking Dr. Massot for this.
Thank you.